in Ottawa. Other news as well. There were protests to mark the anniversary of May Day, the traditional day when unionized labor is celebrated. But in this case, unionized labor is getting kind of angry, Rudyard. And to talk about that, we're joined now in studio by Erin Weir. He's the chief economist with the United Steelworkers. And in Toronto, Buzz Hargrove, welcome to the show, former president of the Canadian Auto Workers. Erin, as I was saying, May Day is traditionally a day to celebrate the achievements of workers and unionization, but it seems more and more that unionized labor is a bit under siege in this country, whether it's cuts announced by the federal government or simply a decline in union membership. Is unionization on the way out in Canada?
Well, I don't think so. I think it is fair to say that it's under siege. I mean, the new year for 2012 started off with two huge lockouts in the private sector. We had former electromotive workers being locked out by Caterpillar in London, Ontario. That was Buzz's union, the Canadian Auto Workers. My union, the United Steelworkers, represents former Alcan employees in Quebec who got locked out by Rio Tinto at the same time. That dispute continues. So labor is under siege, and May Day is an opportunity to assess some of those challenges, draw attention to some of those struggles. But to go back to what you said off the top, I mean, it's also an opportunity to celebrate a lot of the gains that organized labor has made for working people in terms of better pay, benefits, time off, safe working conditions. All of those things are really worth sort of commemorating.
Mr. Hargrove, one of the big challenges Labour faced this year was back-to-work legislation for both Canada Post, obviously one example, and then Air Canada, too. I mean, you've got to wonder, I guess, the value now of belonging to a union when governments seem quite willing and have a lot of public support when it comes to back-to-work legislation. How do you respond?
Well, quite the contrary. I think it highlights the value of belonging to a union. You wouldn't have those choices if government ordered you back to work, or as Erin said, the electromotive locking out people, Rio Tinto. At least as part of a union, you have an opportunity to fight back and try to defend the past gains, but make improvements. I've been around the labor movement around the country for a long while, longer than I care to talk about most days these days, but I've never saw the anger and frustration as high as it is today. The Occupy movement is a result of such disparity in our society, in our economy. Young people, very little opportunity to get decent paying jobs in spite of their education. Corporations, it's almost like we're all supposed to bow down to them, work only to make the executives and the shareholders a lot of money, and we should be happy just to have a job. It's absolutely wrong.
Well, the unionization rate's been going down, though. I'd like you to react to
very little, Tara.
Well,
very little.
It's 38% actually in 1982, 27% in 2010. We just had a statistic up there. Actually, I want to ask you why that is happening, and maybe, Erin, I'll actually start with you. Is it because people are choosing less to unionize, or are governments, for example, hiring more contract workers, people who are not unionized, because the percentage of public sector workers, which makes up the bulk of that unionized labor force, has shrunk considerably?
Well, I think there is more precarious work, more people working in conditions where it's legally actually very difficult to join a union. But it's interesting that your kind of time series starts in the early 80s, because, of course, what we've seen politically in the 1980s and the 1990s is this massive shift to the right, where governments have actually made it a lot more difficult for workers to join unions.
I missed the massiveness of it, but go on.
Well, you had Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I mean, I think Reagan is kind of famous for the first thing he did as president was sort of firing a bunch of air traffic controllers who'd, decided to go out on strike. So, I mean, there has been this shift politically that has actually made it more difficult for workers to organize. I mean, if you do polling, what it tends to show is that people actually think it would be a good idea to be able to get together with their colleagues and negotiate collectively about their pay and conditions of work. People think it makes sense to have some kind of formal procedure in the workplace to make complaints if something is wrong. So I think people want what unions have to offer. It's just governments need to create a legislative environment where it's possible for workers to make that decision and not have employers interfere in the process.
Erin, to close on this issue, in terms of where the labor movement is going, you're allying yourself with some causes that perhaps are not extremely popular in the public mind. I'm thinking specifically of the student strikes in Quebec right now. There are labor unions, in fact, not just in Quebec, but in Ontario, who have sent money to the students to support their cause. only 1/3 of the students are rallying. The public is getting fed up with this strike. Are you on the losing side of an argument here?
Well, I don't think so, and I think actually that case speaks to the fact that unions aren't just concerned about defending the narrow interests of their own members. They are part of sort of broader social coalitions that are trying to make sure, for example, that post-secondary education is accessible to all people. I mean, that's sort of what the struggle is about in Quebec. So I think that unions can and should continue to participate in some of those causes.
All right, Erin Weir, Buzz Hargrove, thank you very much for joining us on this May Day.
Well, thank
We'll talk to
you
you again.
And happy May Day.
Thank you.